thank you very much for your time today. I hope you had a good time, a good start to your morning so far, and that we're settled in for a good discussion. I'm Jerry Wisniewski. I'm the Managing Director of the B2B Technology Practice of EDELMAN in London in the UK. I know you spoke to my colleague from EDELMAN in Smithfield, our financial services offering on day one last week about how public trust in financial services has been affected in the UK. Today, I'm here to talk about why trust matters when you're entering a new market and how you can accelerate your entry if it's done well, how you can build brand trust, what levers you can pull to do that effectively, and how to position your brand to land with your target audience in a very competitive UK market. We've intended this session to be practical rather than theoretical. We're very happy to answer questions at the end of the session and in the Q&A. Please raise your hand in the chat. I'm joined by my colleagues, Camille Oster, who we're speaking to just now. She is head of EDELMAN Emerge, our communications offering for scale-up and high-growth firms. And also Martina Boris, our sort of resident Fintech media expert on the call. They will capture questions in the chat and we'll look to address these or a selection of these at the end in the Q&A. So if we can move on to the next slide, Martina. I can't see anybody at all, so hopefully, hopefully you've all moved on. So EDELMAN, who we are, I don't want to labour too long on this, but we are a leading independent communications marketing firm, the largest in the world, the largest independent one in the world. We've built our reputation around understanding the dynamics of trust between people and institutions, the institutions of business, government, media, and NGOs. And we're known for our trust study every year, which we launch at Davos with our CEO, Richard Edelman. We have scaled and owned offices all around the world in the major markets. We've got expertise in pretty much every sector you can imagine. So obviously tech and B2B is the practice I represent, financial services, where my colleague Andrew Wild last week spoke to you, represents. We've got health, energy, fast moving consumer goods, and much more. You can see a selection of our clients there. Our talent pool pretty much covers every expertise and discipline that you might need or might be required, whether that's strategy and planning, whether that's media relations, whether that's social, digital, crisis, or ESG, and many, many more. So moving on, I believe Camille started to talk to you about EDELMAN Emerge, so apologies if I'm covering ground.
I have, Jerry, so you can move on to the next slide.
Okay, no more. Okay, fantastic. So now I'm going to talk to you specifically about trust and why trust matters. So we've done many, many years of research on trust. We now have 20 years worth of data spanning many different moments in time that the world and the world economies and business have gone through. New entrants into a market typically don't have the network or local track record that usually helps open doors to new opportunities. So trust is a key ingredient to build long-lasting relationships with all your stakeholders, whether that's local employees you're looking to attract to prospective local investors. So we've been studying the dynamics of trust and its impact on reputation. Our latest study, which was released in January of this year, so just pre-COVID, covered 28 markets. We spoke to 400 companies, we talked to business leaders, we reviewed academic articles, looked at stock price analysis, and we found that there are 6 key reasons why trust is important, is critical for building with your customers and stakeholders. I'm just going to cover a number of these. So, trusted companies have better relationships with their customers. Those who are trusted are more likely to have customers that are going to buy, advocate, and defend for you. 3/4 of people, according to our data, say they actively recommend a business they trust, and they will be willing to pay a premium for your product or your service. They want to try your latest innovations. They will stick with your brand even if a competitor is getting better reviews, might be perceived as more innovative or maybe greener. And trusted companies have customers who are more likely to proactively advocate for your brand, like or rate what your brand is saying and doing on social media, and engage with your content. They're also more likely to defend you if they hear someone criticize you, and they're more likely to stick with you if something goes wrong, and things can go wrong. Secondly, trusted firms have trusted employee relationships. 7 in 10 people say they are proud to work for companies they trust. That's really important when you're looking to attract and retain talent, compared to half of those who are embarrassed to work for a company they distrust, and the reputational effects that comes with. They're also more likely to have employees that will recommend them as a great place to work. Trusted companies have greater license to operate. And what we mean by that is only 1 in 5 say they would lobby for more regulation for companies they trust, versus 2 in 5 distrusted businesses. Trusted companies are also more likely to receive institutional investment and investor opportunity. When considering what drives investment decisions, investors say, my trust in the company is the single most important factor, compared to 17 other factors we look at, including financial valuation, including an engaged board of directors. So that really is important. Trust is really important when it comes to investor opportunity. Trusted companies are also more likely to outperform the stock market. And we see in our data over a 1-year period, trusted companies' stocks outperform their sector indexes by more than 5%, so fairly significant. And this represents on average 9.4 billion extra market cap per trusted company. And finally, trusted companies are more resilient in the face of a crisis or risk. So on average, in the case of adverse events impacting you, trusted companies lose 4.7 percentage points less than distrusted companies. So many reasons why you should think about trust upon entering a new market. Is everyone still there? Everyone still with me? I hope so.
Keep going, Jerry. It's all good.
So next slide. So we do see a clear opportunity for fintech to build trust at this moment in time, and to show how it can make a valuable contribution to the lives of its customers, to people, and to play a pivotal role in rebuilding the economy, perhaps better in the wake of COVID. So recreating, new opportunities. Moving on to the next slide, Martina. So hopefully now you should see bar graph. So on this slide, you're seeing that trust in financial services hovered at 57% year on year, which is the grey bar on the far left. And this is data that came out when we launched the annual study released in January 2020. And what was interesting was that we did another release of the data, a smaller amount of countries, in spring, so launched that around May, and we found that trust in the financial services sector, which has always sort of historically been quite low since the financial crash around 2008, 2009, experienced a really sharp spike between January and May of this year, unusually high spike. The reason we believe that this happened is, and we saw this in a number of institutions, including in government, is that during times of crisis, people rally around established institutions. Our data over 20 years has shown that, people tend to gravitate towards the actors on the stage that they believe are going to protect them in a time of crisis. And because this was an economic crisis, or this is an economic crisis as much as a health one, this data points to people appreciating the importance of the banking institutions, the sectors, insurers, lenders, fintech firms, in the effort to keep the economy going and in the effort to keep the economy back and on its feet again. But we know trust spikes are, in our data over the 20 years we've been gathering it, where there's a trust spike, there is also the danger of a rapid trust crash fairly soon after. So there are high expectations on companies in this sector to deliver on the trust that's been placed in them during this time. And it remains to be seen whether the financial sector can continue to capitalise on this increased faith that's been put in as a result of the crisis. Going back to this slide and the original data from January of this year, you'll also see that in emerging fintech innovations, so you'll see in the red bars, P2P transactions, cryptocurrencies, robo-advisory, those are in the red, and they are in the distrusted percentages. But you can see in the sort of bubbles that trust gains are clearly happening, the highest being in cryptocurrency, which gained 11 points year on year. So there's real opportunity to capitalise on these trust gains. Our hypothesis is that the crisis is accelerating adoption of these new technologies. COVID has forced people and firms to conduct business and their financial affairs differently. We've seen people having to adopt more quickly to innovations and new ways of working. So this is going to be a very interesting time for the sector. Martina, would you mind moving on to the next slide? So now you should see the 4 pillars of trust. So how do you build trust, especially if you are fairly new companies entering new markets? So EDELMAN, through our trust data, we've identified 4 main dimensions that we know come into play. And these, I'm going to talk through these briefly. So ability, you need to demonstrate you're good at what you do. Integrity, are you transparent and honest in your communications and through your actions? 3, dependability, are you a firm that keeps its promises? And 4th, do you have a positive impact on society? So when you're entering a new market, you've got to consider how you demonstrate and communicate your ability in all 4 dimensions to build trust. And the more you can do that, the more impactful and the faster you can build trust for the long haul. So moving on to the next slide. What does this mean in practice? And Martina, if you wouldn't mind, if we could move on to talking through some of the practicalities. Are we on get your story right before you tell it? I hope so. So you've got to spend time thinking and articulating the story you want to tell before you go ahead and tell it in the UK market. So this is not very different to any market that you might be entering, but strategy and planning is critical before you take your stories to the UK media. First impressions we know matter. We've seen public examples of scale-ups who may have rushed to announce to new media and stakeholders, whether it's the keenness to get out stories about new partnerships or customers or funding rounds. But if you don't put in the necessary amount of thinking into explaining why your company matters, what's interesting about it at this point in time, and why it's relevant to the UK and to the market that you're launching into, that can present some challenges, and your story may be confusing or key elements of it may be lost. So you need to be really clear about your objectives and what you need to communicate to achieve those. That ensures you're smart with your time and your energy and your focus. So it's best to get that right from the start. So we do a lot of this work with high growth and scale up firms. So these are some elements for you to consider when you're thinking about your positioning and messaging, and before you start to communicate your story externally. So think about what is the context. Why is the UK market, why does it make sense for you to launch your product or offering now and at this moment in time? Is there demand in that market that you've identified through your research? Is there a gap in the current offerings available? Is this genuinely new and innovative, and can you demonstrate that through your arguments and communication? Consider how you show your energy, enthusiasm and passion and excitement in tackling the problem you're solving, and how you're solving it better than others. Language and tone and the way you tell the story is incredibly important, and that's why it's considered a craft, and why many times experts are called in. Are you a brand that's formal? Are you going to take a more conversational style? Are you high energy? Are you a brand whose tone and language is much more reflective or thoughtful? Those all can land in how you tell your story and how you show up visually, how your spokespeople can come across. So it's really important that you take time to think about how you want to land. Then timeliness. Be prepared to answer the question, what makes you relevant right now? The world has clearly changed in the time of COVID. What makes you a positive addition to it right now in this period of time? Sometimes we've advised clients or counsels, companies to perhaps keep their powder dry, wait for a launch moment that makes sense when all the right elements of your story are together, and you have maybe a bigger, more powerful and impactful story to tell. So there's many considerations when it comes to timeliness. Credibility. How do you tell or prove to people that you are credible and trusted? So you need to really build this credible picture of the team and your founder story, of your history and your heritage. You know, why is your team the right people to take this company internationally, to scale into new markets such as CK? If you've hired people locally with great relevant local expertise, how can you showcase them? How can you build that picture of, you know, this is exactly the right kind of team that can be trusted, and that you know, media excitement can be built around. When it comes to momentum, you can certainly draw on and point to your growth and successes in other markets, and that demonstrates that you're bringing a strong track record with you. And finally, be really clear about what action you want people to take. You know, once your story has been told, what do you want people, businesses, companies, what action do you want them to take as a result of learning about you? Are you pointing them to your app, your website? Do you want them to download a piece of gated content so you can develop a pipeline of opportunities? Really think carefully about what you want to happen as a result of your story. And here we've got an example, a very well-known, recognised one in Monzo. So Monzo's mission is very clearly to, you know, they're very clear about their vision, what they're doing. We're building a bank together. It's very much about a community effort. Their style, their tone is quite community orientated. It's quite conversational, and they've been really successful at establishing a powerful consumer brand that tackled a fundamental problem that they had clearly identified, was that consumer banking wasn't working. Martina, can we move on to the next slide? Are you still with me?
Yes, we are. You have the next slide. Story tell and story do. Everyone should see that now.
Tell and story do. Right. So what we mean by story tell and story do is just think about how you align your vision, what you say you're going to do, what you say you are doing with the reality and through your actions. So point one is be very, very clear about what you offer today versus the potential and what you might offer in the future. Media very quickly sniff out false promises. They really do. I mean, we'll talk about this later, but you know, they are stretched, but they you know, there's still very much the onus on them to research their stories thoroughly, and they will speak to multiple parties before publishing anything. So be careful about, you know, over egging where you currently are, because that could damage your reputation with them. Point 2 is just practice what you preach. So you can't just make claims or offer platitudes. You've got to stand by what you say and demonstrate action. We've seen this in sort of the past, I mean, six to 9 months. You might want to express sort of views on issues around diversity, around gender equality, around balancing work and life, about progression opportunities in your firm. But you've always got to practice what you preach. If you're going to make external statements supporting, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement, you've got to make sure that you've looked at the composition of your own workforce, and then what you can do to address those issues within your company, because you will get asked, what are you doing to address these? And I think it's important to understand that it's you can show vision, you can show ambition for wanting to do things differently, but be very clear about where you are today and what do you need to do to change things for the better for tomorrow. And I think point 3 is related. You know, take a close look at your internal workings before you talk about anything externally. And your employee audience can be really powerful when you're entering a new market, especially if you are you have local employees. They can be used to, you know, consider how you will activate them or use them to help create your mission statement or workplace culture so that's aligned with the reality of working there, as an example. You can, of course, talk about your ambitions to improve and build on your culture. You may also have problem areas to address. Many companies have things that they need to improve on, but show how you plan to tackle those areas proactively and be candid and honest. Don't pretend you are someone or something or somewhere that you're not currently at. So here we have an example of Revolut. So of course Revolut has had huge growth in its customer base, big ambitions, but we've seen stories circulate in mainstream media about its corporate culture and toxic corporate culture, and many different publications in the sector covered it. So sadly that tainted its reputation. And clearly they're working on the issues, which is highly commendable, and I'm sure they will address them, but the damage has been done. So if we move on to point 3, so Martina, if we can move on to the next slide. So consider when building trust in a new market, be a partner, not a supplier. So when you're entering a new market, it's often about demonstrating relevance, understanding and empathy with the local community, with the local market. No matter what sector you are coming from, whether you're a neobank, you're a payment service provider, whether you're an alternative lending app, if you're growing quickly, you may need to launch in several new markets at once. And it can be tempting to, you know, move extremely fast and aggressively to conquer this new environment. And we know, working with scale-ups in this space, you know, there is that need to move fast, but be careful as you do that too, and be intentional, we would say. Prove you understand the local nuances, rather than offering sort of a blanket service. Show how you've adapted it, how you've tailored it to the local market, to local people, to local businesses, to the trends in that geography. When you partner locally, hire locally where you can, think locally when devising a brand. Prove that your product or service can have a true impact on the lives of the people in that new market. You can also use some of your first local customers really effectively as advocates to build credibility. And here we're sharing an example. This is actually one of our clients, a company, well, it was a client that we helped at a point in its journey called Risk. They have an insurance platform, and they leveraged one of their very first partnerships with BMW to great impact, and established their expertise in the B2B2C automotive insurance market. A totally new area for them as they pivoted away from a consumer product. So they really thought carefully about, and they spent a good deal of time planning how they were going to launch that partnership to great success, as you can see here in the coverage. Moving on to the next slide, point 4, Martina. So yes, again, when building trust, be really open about the challenges and of course the opportunities on entering a new market. We've seen fintech firms can be, subject to overhype and sometimes overpromise. Sometimes the media and the media conversation tends to spill over into that sort of space. But it can be in your advantage to admit if you don't have all the answers. There are growing pains. We know there are scaling challenges as you move to multiple markets, and it makes you much more trustworthy and human if you talk about some of the difficulties. And we've seen many examples time and time again of CEOs and founders and teams who are really candid about the issues that they faced, and they've used that as a platform to stand out from the competition and to earn media attention and respect. And media loves stories about struggle, about triumph over adversity, on the road to success. So, own your challenges, we would say. This isn't about oversharing, it's about being transparent, and of course, talking about barriers, but being enthusiastic, of course, about the potential of your technology, your vision, and where it's going to go next. And if your product needs to evolve into something different as a result of local specifics or as part of a scaling strategy, you don't have to communicate communicate it as a failure when things go wrong. You can make sure this is a key part of your strategy to make your technology much more widely accessible and available. So it's really about how you sort of frame challenges on the path to success as learning experiences. So the example on the right is Zopa. So P2P lending, as we know, has been under extreme pressure at this moment in time in the pandemic. But Zopa and the CEO has managed to get a lot of respect and attention in the media because he's been very good at acknowledging the challenges of the space while being optimistic about its potential. So many more examples of that in the fintech space. Are you still with me? Everyone still here?
Yes, we are.
Yep, we are.
Just making sure we're all awake. Great. I hope you've got questions lined up. We're moving on to 5, Martina, so embrace the regulatory conversation. So a lot of high growth companies, disruptive companies, challenger brands will operate in a very tricky area for regulators. They'll be providing a new kind of offering that laws and authorities just haven't had the time to consider at length yet. So there's this kind of time lag. If you know you are operating in an area where that's going to, this debate's going to become business critical for you in the future, it's really important for you to get on the front foot with it, especially as the UK is highly regulated as a market. Not to mention that your customers, your partners, your competition, banks, pension funds, asset managers are all well versed on this topic. We have seen that a lot of fintech challengers, brands are happy to simply just say, they support productive rulemaking. But we don't believe that goes far enough, and we don't think that differentiates you. But one tactic we believe is highly effective is to lead and drive the conversation and try and be the rulemaker yourself. And the way you can do that is to offer your industry insights to legal entities, regulators and governments, engage in a conversation in media to give it a public platform, communicate on whole sector issues, and point to how better collaboration between business, government, and other industry organisations can collaborate to fix them. In short, what we're saying is don't risk being called out on potential roadblocks and problems. Instead, show that you're already thinking about the potential solutions. So those are 5 key considerations and areas to consider as you're building trust, as you're entering the UK. Now, this next section we're going to move on to is we're going to talk about the media landscape. So Martina, we're going to give you some insights into what's going on in UK media, the topics they're interested in, some of the key publications and journalists. We hope this is going to be helpful to you as you think about your entry plans. So if we move on to the UK media landscape right now. Martina, are we there?
Yes, we are.
Yeah, fantastic. So, the UK media is operating in a very challenging time. It's probably not it's not dissimilar to other markets. What we find is they are operating very, very lean editorial teams. So COVID has completely transformed the way that the newsrooms and reporters are offering. People have been furloughed, jobs have been lost. Those who are still in role and working are extraordinarily busy. Interviews are taking place over video call. In studio audiences are gone. And many journalists who maybe perhaps covered 1 or 2 beats can now be covering 3 or 4 beats, or have been asked to cover areas they may not have historically covered. So they are very time constrained. So, when we're talking to media, our role as communicators, as PR people, and if you are considering talking to media yourselves, just really be aware of the strains that they're operating under, the same strains that we are operating under. They've got deadlines and working strange hours, care responsibilities, children to look after. So just treat them as human beings. They are, we talk to them regularly. We have a lot of data about who's writing what and where and what's impacting them. They're feeling really stretched and overworked. That means we have to tread really carefully in offering them valuable stories, because they just simply don't have time to be unfocused right now. So really consider how you're going to exchange something of value with them when their time is such a precious commodity. So it's never been more important that, if you're going to pick up a phone to a journalist, you've done your research. Look at the last few articles that they've written, the last articles in the past few months. What are the topics they tend to cover? What trends do they seem to be, passionate about? Which companies are they talking to? What's their writing style? Think about all those elements when speaking to them. There was a time when relationship building was really important, an important tool in our armory as PR people when talking to journalists. We used to be able to take them out for background briefings, but I think that's pretty much now off the table. We're really not doing as many of those as before. So those meetings weren't ever intended to generate coverage, but they could provide lots of context. If you are going to try and reach out and try and do virtual relationship building, it is possible, but again, you've got to be really thoughtful about what it is you're exchanging that's of value, and just go in with modest expectations. You can of course ask for a virtual briefing, but you may not get it, and it may be best to save your news for a better moment in time, so that they can actually write a story off the back of a conversation with you. Other points to note, so media is still receptive to COVID-19 stories. I think we've gone through phases of fatigue around this, and media have been ready to move on and cover other things, but there is still very much there is receptiveness if you can contribute meaningfully, authentically to a conversation about how you're addressing some of the problems that have resulted because of the pandemic. Consumers want brands to stop selling to them. They want them to start solving challenges. So if you can show how you're doing that, that is going to be really effective with you when you talk to media. The crisis has highlighted just how critical technology is to underpinning society and solving the challenges. So this definitely is an area where fintech can shine and show that it's responding to some of those challenges. Finally, I think we've seen increasing demand for contributed content. So what we mean by that is written content penned by you, placed in that publication, instead of the journalist writing it themselves. But there is an expectation that if you are going to contribute with written contributed content, that it is crafted to the highest standard, and it's relevant for publications' audiences, it's forward thinking, it's vendor neutral. That's really important, that you aren't seen to be selling. We're talking about issues and trends instead. And ideally, it's got to come from a C-level executive within the organisation. They may not need to write it. You may be able to get someone else to write it, and you can finesse it. You may be able to get your PR firm to support you with that. But there are more opportunities for written content. And finally, we've seen virtual event overload. So we've been trying to replicate face-to-face meetings in a digital virtual space. It doesn't quite replicate the in-person experience. You don't get the sort of human connection. People are still doing them, but we know the journalists are finding it increasingly hard. If you are going to run a virtual event, if you're planning to run a customer event, which might include a panel, and you want to invite journalists along because you think it could be interesting, just really think carefully and be honest about what value you think the media are going to get from attending. If you're going to be doing something that is genuinely different, unexpected, from which they might be able to get a story out of, because they are time poor and they want to get the most bang from their time, then yes, consider it. But you can break bridges if you invite them to things and promise that they can get stories, which then they can't. Unfortunately, we have seen that happen. So just make sure you understand particularly the power of using customers in those events. Customers will always help you generate coverage, and third-party credible spokespeople, beyond your organisation's walls, will also help them create a story. But a vendor-only event, if it's just you talking, that's not likely to cut through. So a couple of points to think about. All being said, if you've got strong positioning and messaging, if you've got good stories to land, if you've thought about the brand and how to build a trusted relationship, you can certainly make really strong headway with UK media at this time. It's just got to be done thoughtfully. Moving on. to the next slide. What's hot and what's not. So what we tend to see is that there are hot topics that get covered in the UK media. The media tends to convene around the themes. We see sort of commonalities across business media and in the sector trades. Often the sector trades go into much more technical detail than the business or national press may do. But what we've done here is just talk or grab some of the current themes that tend to grab the lion's share of attention. It's not exhaustive in any way at all. There are going to be more than these, but just to give you a flavour of sort of what's been covered now. The cashless society is a hot topic, and how payments via contactless technology has been fast-tracked by the pandemic. We've seen falls as high as 50% in the volume and value of cash withdrawals. Consumers who rely on cash, such as the vulnerable and the elderly, have been impacted and had to find alternatives. And it looks like, given the subsequent waves we're going to see, that's going to continue. So there is a problem and an obstacle, but it is a problem that business can solve and improve the lives of citizens. We expect this to be a topic that's going to remain topical over the coming months. It could be relevant for you. Do you have a view on this? Does it impact your business, your customers, or the wider industry you operate in? Can you use technology to find new ways to bring all consumers along with you to address this problem? The second topic is reaching the unreached, or the unbanked. According to a report from the World Bank, close to 1.7 billion people still don't have access to or are part of a substantial financial system. There's clearly work to be done to improve financial inclusion. This is a topic that has been talked about for some time. The pandemic is probably going to widen the gap between the haves and the have-nots, even in the developed markets, particularly in the developed markets, probably. And media remain interested in solutions that are challenging the traditional systems. So if your product or your service helps, even in a small way, to shape that future and give better access to those who have been underserved or underrepresented, that is an angle that will certainly be of interest to media. The third topic is personalised investments. Historically, the entry point for investments has been really high, but fintechs are now providing options for consumers to invest much smaller amounts directly. Individuals are exploring DIY investment services. Media have reported on how the pandemic has accelerated this trend. And alongside this, we're seeing, alongside this expanding of what an investor is or who an investor is, we've seen this close focus on responsible investment, so investment that aligns to personal values. Is your portfolio of investments that you're making socially responsible? We expect the media to continue exploring those topics, such as the use of machine learning and AI for personalised investments, so that the technology can help them make conscious, ethical choices. But on a more general level, there's more opportunity for fintechs to talk about levelling the playing field between, professional investors and novice investors in a way that wasn't previously possible. That has come with some challenges and debate, but it is an area that is being covered in the media. And then a final example is embedded finance. So think here about Apple Card, think about Shopify merchant accounts, think about Amazon loans. Increasingly, non-banking players are branching out into banking services. They are looking to improve user experiences, tap into new revenue lines. We've seen that embedded finance, this trend in this topic and interest from media is here to stay. It's being discussed extensively within key fintech and business media. The debate really is evolving around the implications. So, what is the role of incumbent financial institutions as these non-traditional firms start to offer what are considered sort of traditional banking services? How will the competitive structure of the financial services market change, and so on? So particularly the entry of big tech into financial services has been, a big conversation. We don't believe it needs to, lead to fear or concern. Instead, we believe that fintechs can position themselves as collaborators and can work together with those companies, and both the traditional sort of financial services companies and big techs, and use their platforms to establish themselves in the global markets. So again, not exhaustive topics, many more, but just to give you a sense of what's going on. As we move on to point 3, I'm going to ask Martina now to step in and talk about the tech media.
Perfect. Good morning, everyone. So this is a very...
Martina, sorry to interrupt. We're running behind time, so we need to try and move things along a little faster, if you wouldn't mind. So
no problem.
Thank you.
No problem.
Okay, thanks.
So this is a very top-level overview of the fintech media targets from kind of a perspective. And this is based on the fact that as a business that is entering to a new market, you have a different audiences to reach, and there is no one size fits all approach when it comes to the meaningful media relationships. So there will be variety of topics you'll be able to talk to, but landing messages in the target media will require kind of tailored stories and various approaches. So there are essentially different tactics you can use to drive activity, but you need to kind of understand what works best for each of those kind of segments here, and specific journalists, which we'll be talking about in a few slides down the line. But to give you some example, Raconte from the Times or CNBC, they won't necessarily accept opinion pieces, but you stand a really good chance with placing a comment or execs briefings when the opportunity arises. But for contributions, you kind of need to look at the right-hand side on this chapter. This tends to be trade media, so they tend to have a smaller reach than the Times or Financial Times of this world, but are super targeted towards kind of your financial services audiences that you are keen to influence. And again, that's not extensive kind of list of publications. You should probably have here sifted of this work and the next web. Also tech publications, so tech trades who are increasingly kind of covering fintech as a separate sector. So again, this is just to kind of give you an idea of the key titles that you should be considering to have on your in your press office capabilities.
Thanks, Martina.
Yeah, we can answer any questions in the Q&A session. So yeah, feel free to think of some questions about the publications as well. Over to you, Jerry.
So the next slide is just talking about how you build your story. I'm very conscious of time and trying to catch up because unfortunately the technical issues at the beginning. I'm not going to go through this in detail. What I will say is when you're thinking about how to pitch to media, there are a number of different levers you can use to improve the newsworthiness of your story. These are some of the elements that you can consider. We have a tool to enable you to look at your story through these various lenses. So whether it's thinking about how you can highlight attention in the story, opposing views, whether it's how you use surprise to tell the story in a different way or bring in unusual voices that you wouldn't expect. There are a number of different levers you can use to earn the attention of your audience and elevate the impactfulness of the story. So we're now moving on to the final slide, and I'm going to hand back to Martina because she knows these journalists and these publications very well, but some key people to know.
Yeah, so thank you, Jerry. These guys are a few kind of fintech editors that shape the fintech debate here in the UK. And you should definitely try and build relationship with them. And now I know Jerry was just talking about this. Now the kind of building relationship with journalists is it's quite difficult given our current kind of economic situation and the you know not lack of ability to see people in person. However, I think that there are a couple of kind of tips we can give you for further down the line, if you like. So firstly, I think if you have the opportunity to meet a reporter in person, take it. Not only just meeting in person, let reporters know you see them as a resource. It shows them that you are a resource to them as well. And you know, grabbing a coffee, I think it never will kind of create an instant friendship, but having kind of multiply in-person or virtual meeting throughout the year, attending panels that the reporter might be moderating, and kind of interacting with them on social channels, kind of all work together to forge a real connection over time. And I think you know, real relationship never feels transactional. So you know, don't try to be super salesy. And I think Jerry mentioned this before. Like, not every meeting will result in coverage, but you just need to be kind of aware of that and be very you know, be very conscious of that. And I would say, try and be yourself. Like, these guys are real people, and to have like a real relationship, like, don't try to grill them on the next story they're writing about and how you can, you know, how you can get publicized. You know, start with kind of genuine questions about their lives, about their interests. Of course, it's good to kind of get a sense of their scope on the next story, but again, try to position yourself as a source to them, as opposed to you know, you're trying to get benefit of meeting them, of meeting with them. And again, this is just a very kind of top level snapshot of a couple of people that we would suggest you start kind of following on social media, connecting on LinkedIn, seeing what they write about. It's not extensive list, and I promise you it was quite hard to pick the top 9. Emily Nicole, she is a tech reporter at CTAM, but she's moving to a role as a fintech correspondent at Financial News. So that's why she's here on the list, just to kind of give you a heads up of her move. Oliver Smith, you might have seen him in the likes of BBC or ITV interviews. He's very often asked to kind of share opinion of the big fintech trends. He covers like neobanks and kind of early stage startups, as well as some cryptocurrency now. Jo McKnight, you can spot her at a very kind of the most important fintech events of the year. She's very often moderating the panels. She's the managing director of The Banker. She is a host of the Breaking Bank podcast, very popular here in the UK, and the Tech Talks as well, which is like a video series. And she very often talks to like fintechs because she want to hear like a fresh perspective on the landscape. So although The Banker here historically is very much financial services, financial institutions, banks, she really kind of taps into the fintech, and she want to understand more about how the financial traditional systems are influenced by fintechs. So I think, yeah, very important kind of targets for you guys. Isabel Woodford, Sifted. So she's fintech correspondent, startups and scale-ups mainly. She does the interview. She's very lovely person as well. So if you had a chance, maybe connect with her on LinkedIn or on Twitter, see what stories she writes about, comment on her stories. You know, she's very kind of engaged in that way. Madhvi, Finextra and Forbes. For Finextra, she does pretty much everything. She's managing editor for Forbes. She really looks into kind of stories that interest her and close to her heart, which is financial inclusion, reaching unbanked, and lately embedded finance. So she would report on the kind of big tech players coming into fintech space. So again, quite interesting scope here, and lots of opportunities. Sometimes I would chat to Madhvi about. Finextra story, which I would imagine would be a Finextra story, and we end up having an interview for Forbes because she feels like this fits perfectly with something else she also works on. So again, this is the relationship that keeps on giving, and she's a lovely person as well, and always keen to kind of meet with people in the industry. And then lastly, Sharon, Fintech Features and Banking Technology magazine, the biggest, I think, trades in the UK. Fintech Features has now What's the Fintech podcast, which is worth checking out. They do quite a lot of kind of sponsored contributions. However, they do still kind of run a large editorial opportunities. So again, it's worth building a relationship with Sharon and the guys in those publications. And again, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. I'm very conscious of time, so I just realized I didn't take a single breath and I just talked at you. But I believe we have a couple of more minutes if there are any questions on any of these. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Martina and Jerry. We do have some time for a couple of questions, and I really appreciate people hanging in there. Because obviously, you know, a few technical issues at the beginning, but if you're happy to hang in there, we can definitely have some questions. So by all means, put your screen on and ask away. One question I could start with, Jerry and Martina. Some of these companies, maybe many of these companies, don't have a full-time CMO. So is that a problem? I mean, you know, do they need to have a CMO that you know, looks after the company's sort of marketing, comms, PR, or do you think it's not an issue at all?
We rarely see companies will have that level of expert, and we're very used to working directly with the founders or, you know, senior leaders, co-founders within the organization. Of course, it's always helpful if there's somebody that has experience internally, but it's not problematic. We find that it's much more important that you are really clear about what the objectives are up front, and you agree those with whoever you're working with, and that you're clear on what you need to do to achieve against those objectives. And yeah, it's not problematic. It's just a different way of working, and the onus is very much then on your partner or, you know, your PR firm to just advise you through that, and sometimes help you understand what's required to create stories, messaging, positioning that are going to have impact.
Thank you for that. Right, any questions from the cohort? Anything that springs to mind before we start wrapping up?
We've talked at you for an hour. Very happy to answer questions over email or on LinkedIn.
Peter.
Thanks,
Hassan here.
Yeah, Hassan, go ahead.
Yeah. So let's just break that down real quick. Marketing, comms, PR, roles, classic responsibility, or say how it should be done in the current times. You know, we have a PR lead. We've got a head of global marketing, but and then I tend to do a little bit of this and that. So we're all sort of doing all sorts of stuff. It's you know, it's a bit of this and that. It will be superb to get some structure here from you guys.
Yeah, I was wondering maybe if is Camille here? Camille, are you there?
I don't think she joined yet, no.
Oh no, so she might have dropped off then. Because we're on the same line. So anyway, let me try and answer that question. So yes, I mean, when we're typically working with firms at this stage, yes, there are people tending to lead on different elements of communications and handling of media. What we like to do very, very early on is just be clear about roles and responsibilities and how we're going to work together, and who's going to lead on what internally, as well as who is going to be sort of your client relationship lead. So it's really just about defining roles and responsibilities very early on. I mean, you're very lucky if you're entering a new market and you have people in those positions, but not everybody does, in which case we often work with the founders, the co-founders, or whoever is kind of taking on that PR communications role. Sometimes it's often the CFO that ends up taking on this role too. We've seen that fairly frequently, and so just being really clear on what the expectations are, the roles and the responsibilities of each person involved.
Thanks, Jerry. It's a scary prospect that the CFO does the marketing, but I'm sure we can all cope. So before we do a wrap up, just to say that if you are thinking of the pitch day and you haven't registered, remain on this call. The Newfound team will be kept online, so that if there's any questions or any concerns you have, then we're here on this call. So just wrapping up now. Thank you very much for Jerry and Martina, a great masterclass on PR and positioning and making sure that you've got the right story, because that's so important in the marketplace. Now, obviously, thanks to Chris and Graham from Zavandra as well about research, which hopefully has opened your eyes, which is the whole purpose of Market Missions, is keeping your eyes open. And we start across tomorrow at 8 a.m. BST. Two great panels, I would say that, but they are. Tech and data considerations. So we've managed to secure a really strong panel for that, including the technical lead from AWS. And so if you've got tech issues or questions, they will be almost certainly answered tomorrow. And then the second panel, it's fantastic entrepreneurs who have built businesses, successful businesses, scale-ups in the UK from overseas markets, and they can share their stories. And they'll be moderated by Charlie Dillingpole, who's also a very successful entrepreneur who's scaled his business in the UK as well. So you should not miss that. So thank you very much to EDELMAN and Jerry and Martina. But as I say, we'll hang on there. If you wish to sort of ask about pitch day, then please stay on the call. Thanks very much.
You're very welcome. Thank you very much, everyone, for your time. Hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, guys. And again, we are open to receive any questions via email, or we'll be hanging on the same platform as well if there's anything. Thanks again.